I really appreciate all the work that you all do throughout the year, particularly this year, which has been such a with it being locked down and then opened up in stages, and what we can do and what we can't do. Um, and I really like this particular topic. I'm a bio nerd. I just love just diving into the intricacies of the natural world around us. Um, a lot of the field trips that you go on or that I'll lead oftentimes focuses on identifying species. And that's the first step oftentimes in understanding the world around us, is to learn the players, what the species of plants and animals and fungi are in the world around us. And most of the field guides that we have will group similar species together so that we can recognize them, we can distinguish between them, but that's not the way you find them in the natural world. And you could very easily come to the conclusion, looking at a field guide, that any tree can be found anywhere, any flower can be found anywhere, any bird can be found anywhere. And that's not really true. And you learn that kind of in the next stage as you're getting to learn about the natural world. You learn how the species group together and they form communities. And that's the basis of ecology, is learning how living things interact with each other and with the world around them, the forces of nature that are around them. And there are some ecological guides that group species as they are found together. There was one that was published many years ago about the big thicket, the wildflowers of the big thicket, that had the plates, the illustrations organized by community, forest community, and then the text was the typical taxonomic where you have related plants grouped together. And I thought that was an intriguing way to do it. There's also at least one bird guide out there that groups birds by the habitat in which you find them. The Peterson Field Guide series has a pair of books, The Ecology of Eastern Forests and The Ecology of Western Forests, and I borrow quite a bit from them in their understanding of how to look at types of forest. And I want to look at a couple of types of forests here. I'll focus on plant communities because they're usually the focal species, because they're easy to observe, move, and some are specialized to particular niches in their environment. They become indicator species, and I'll talk more about indicator species a little bit. Notice that the subtitle here is Observations of Field Biologist. It's just observations. I'm not a professional ecologist, so these aren't definitive. These are just kind of my musings, really, based on the things that I've seen when I've been out on the Canyonlands. But it can always be, adjusted. There could be divisions and things. But I want to talk particularly about two major forest types we see on the preserve, and then one or maybe two, if we have time, little micro communities. So I'd like to get started into that. On the preserve, the forest and woodland is the dominant habitat, and that's primarily because most of the acreage that our permit requires us to set aside, most of our acreage to be managed for golden cheek warblers. And the reasons for that are fairly intricate. I won't get into that, but the golden cheek warblers are forest interior species, and they need large patches of forest and woodland where the canopy covers at least 70%. So that's most of what the preserve looks like. But it protects habitat not just for golden cheek warblers, it's also for many native forest plants, and some of them are endemic to Texas. Some of them are narrowly focused in just a small area on the Edwards Plateau, which also indicates just how special this area is. It's also a meeting place for a lot of plants and animals from the southeastern United States, the southwestern United States, and Mexico. They all kind of meet in this area. So much of the preserve looks like this. You'll see a lot of hills covered with ash juniper. There are some other trees here. There's a Texas red oak right over in here. There's probably a live oak, maybe a live oak down in here. But a lot of it looks like this. And then a lot of it looks like this. These are areas where there is some juniper. You can see some here in the foreground, and you see some in the background ridge there. And there's a live oak down here in the lower left. But most of these are broadleaf deciduous trees, deciduous hardwood trees. They're coming out in spring green in this photograph. And those are two different kinds of forests that you can find. So the forest isn't uniform across the preserve. And it varies by many different factors. I've listed some of the most common factors. If you're not familiar with some of these terms, the aspect is the direction a slope faces. So you have a slope that faces north or east will have different kinds of flora, different kinds of plants than a slope that faces south and west. And that's primarily because south and west slopes get a lot more of the hottest part of the sun, the hottest sun during the warmest part of the day, so they tend to be drier. And those facing north and east tend to retain their moisture longer. But all of these factors can play into the different kind of forest. And drier areas tend to be dominated by juniper. And wetter areas in our area tend to be dominated by Texas red oak. In other areas of the Edwards Plateau, they can be replaced or supplemented by other broadleaf species such as cedar elm, lacy oak in more to the west of us, shin oak maybe more to the north of us, but there are several other species. Texas ash can also be a dominant tree in this kind of environment, but in our area, Texas red oak is a dominant species, particularly in the really moist canyon heads, canyon bottoms, north and east facing slopes, and where you have extra water in seep zones. So I'd like to look first at those mesic canyons and bottomlands, this kind of a forest here, and look at kind of what, it's the less common forest type that you could find on the preserve. It needs some protection from the drying aspect of sun and wind, so it's not on exposed ridges, but it does have the most diversity. There's a lot more, because there's more moisture, there's a lot of opportunities for a variety of plants to growing in those areas. It's also, and there are a variety of deciduous trees you can find there, and this is a list of some of them. You can find some others, particularly when it gets much wetter in the bottomlands. You have sycamore and American elm. You can also have hackberries. You can even have pecans in the bottomland. You can also have shin oak, particularly when it gets a little drier. But these in particular are common canopy trees, with the Texas red oak being dominant, but the others can easily join in with them, or frequently join in with them. And underneath those trees, you also have a wide variety of understory trees and shrubs. And here are some of the common ones. And here I'm using that term indicator species. That's an ecological term having to do with communities of plants and animals. An indicator species is one that its presence is a good indicator that you're talking about that particular community. It's not definitive. It's not as if you have a Carolina buckthorn, one growing here, then you definitely have a mesic forest. You can have Carolina buckthorn growing in dry forest. You could have one growing in the open. But a preponderance of Carolina buckthorn and rusty blackhaw and red buckeye and American beautyberry, if those are common, those are the common species you have, then yes, you have a more mesic forest type. So it's kind of like if you're trying to identify a forest community or plant community, the indicator species are kind of like field marks when you're looking to identify a species. So if you have a bird that's mostly red, well, it could be a cardinal or it could be a summer tanager. If you have a bird that has a crest of feathers, a pointed crest on its head, it could be a cardinal again, or a blue jay, or a titmouse. If you have a bird that has a large bill, conical bill that's good for cracking open seeds, again, it could be a cardinal, or it could be a grosbeak, or it could be a puroloxia, a close cousin of the cardinal. If it has a crest and a large bill, it could be cardinal or purloxia, but it's got all three, it's a cardinal. So it's the same thing with the indicator species is, or the forest community is. In this kind of habitat, in addition to the shrubs and the understory trees, there can also be a lot of ground vegetation. And I like to look at some of those, particularly some of the plants that are more difficult to find. They're narrower ranges. They're oftentimes endemic to Texas, or even narrowly to the Edwards Plateau. And a great example of that is the bird. The plant on the left here, Heller's Marbleseed. It's found in only 8 counties, all found in Texas. That's its entire world range, is those 8 counties in Texas. It can be actually fairly common in moist forests of the Edwards Plateau around Austin. We find it quite fairly commonly on the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. A good place to see it, if you have not been there, is Baker Sanctuary, Travis Audubon's Baker Sanctuary, particularly their North Canyon. I've led hikes over there before and have been astounded by the density of Heller's Marbleseed there. It grows quite abundantly in that area, but you can find it in the Barton Creek Greenbelt. You could probably find it also at Emma Long Park and many other areas that have moister forests. It's a distinctive plant, not really brightly colored, but very interesting flowers. And along with that, giant spiderwort. It's probably endemic to Texas. There are a few scattered records in East Texas, but it's mostly in the eastern Edwards Plateau and the Lampasas Cut Plain to the north. There is a population apparently in Ruston, Louisiana, but there's some thought it might have originated from cultivated plants. Its name indicates, of course, is the tallest of our spiderworts. It can grow 2 to 3 feet tall, which is tall for the spiderworts that are oftentimes very low plants. The flowers you've probably seen it if you've been in wet forests in the spring. I say wet, moister forests in the spring. It has flowers that range from blue violet all the way to pink, frequently pink, but generally more of a purple tone. And they're all pretty tall. It's very distinctive, showy flower in the spring. Some other endemic species you can find in this habitat later in the year are Drummond's Ruellia, and we have many species of Ruellia. This one, though, is the only endemic we have. It's found in a total of 18 counties in central Texas. It ranges to Dallas County. It's distinguished from the other Ruellia species. The flowers are in the leaf axils. They aren't restricted to the top of the plant like the common wild petunia or common Ruellia. The flowers are purple rather than white. One species has white flowers, and the leaves are fairly large, kind of scalloped margins with fairly long petioles, leaf stalks. And that's one way you can distinguish Drummond's Ruellia, which tends to grow in bottomlands. A good place to find it is along the Turkey Creek Trail at Emma Long Park. It grows in profusion along that trail. And it's a good place to see that. It generally blooms during the summer, so it's one of the bright spots of color during the summer when everything is very green otherwise. And then, of course, that stunning scarlet leather flower in the Clematis genus. The petals are actually not petals, those are sepals, and they are actually quite leathery. If you're not familiar with it, it's a really stunning flower. And it also is a plant, it can grow in a bit more wide ranging, it can grow in some open sun, but it needs to have pretty good deep, moist soil, deep, rich soils to grow well. And it's also found in only 16 counties in Texas. Another couple of species they're not endemic, but they're definitely distinctive in this area are the Lindheimer silk tassel. It ranges into Mexico, but it's a common evergreen shrub that you'll find in this area. You may be familiar with it. It's not showy. It's a nice green color throughout the winter, but the flowers that you see there, that's about as showy as it gets. That's the flowers of the silk tassel. It does produce a fruit, a black fruit that's kind of berry-like, but it's hard. It's not edible. But it is very a recognizable plant, and it would be probably, it could be a good ornamental, providing some evergreen foliage through the winter. False dayflower is an annual. It can grow in profusion in these moist forests. It has that kind of, looks to me like a deranged Mickey Mouse face. It's a really strange looking flower, but it has been found, look up my notes here, I'm trying to remember this one. This one has actually, there's one record in Durango, Mexico, so it may not be endemic, but most records are found in South and on the Edwards Plateau and on the Lampasas Cut Plain. So it's very distinctive to our area. And then these are not, there are not endemic species, but because this is a moister environment in a comparatively dry region of the country, we have a lot of plants that grow in the eastern forests that are at the extreme western edge of their range. And these are 3 of them here. If we had more of the spice bush, we might be able to host some spice bush swallowtail butterflies, but I think they're too far, few and far between in our area to be able to support a population. Black snakeroot is a plant for the real bio nerd. It's not a very showy plant. That's about as showy as it gets. Green dragon is also not showy, but once you see the flower, you won't forget it. If you're familiar with the jack-in-the-pulpit from the eastern forests, this is a close cousin. This is the closest cousin that we have in this area. But unlike the jack-in-the-pulpit, the flower is entirely green. It doesn't have streaks of brown. And the tongue, the spadix, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, extends way outside the spathe, way outside the flower, so it looks like the dragon is breathing fire outside of its mouth there. And in addition to these eastern species, there are also some western species that are at the eastern edge of the range. And one of the most stunning of those is the Texas milkweed, which has these amazingly immaculate snow white flowers that appear in the deep shadows that, of the forest in June. It's one of the few flowers that will bloom once the canopy closes down in June. And it's a remarkable looking plant. I do not believe that this milkweed is a particularly important for monarch butterflies. I don't think it has enough of the toxic substances in the sap that help. Because this is a more mesic environment, of course, then we also have a lot of ferns. And there are actually 10 species of ferns that we found at least on the Balcones Preserve. There are these widespread species. None of them are endemic, but they have a mix from the east, west, north, and south. These are all pretty widespread here. Alabama lip fern is probably the most commonly encountered on the preserve. It tolerates a bit drier conditions than the others. Maidenhair fern, of course, needs no introduction for most people. It's very well known around waterfalls. But we also have these a little bit more specialty. These plants don't meet anywhere else in the world, I don't believe. Resurrection fern is a fern of the southeastern United States. We are actually outside of its range here, but we have a few isolated populations here. So it's actually outside of its range. It always grows on another surface. This one here was growing on the trunk of a large live oak. It can also grow on rocks. They never actually grow on the ground. They're always on an elevated surface. And this was in a remote canyon on the preserve. We have very few populations of this because we are outside of its range. Lindheimer's maiden fern is very similar to a species of the southeastern, of East Texas, but is actually a different species. Lindheimer's maiden fern ranges westward, so we're at the eastern edge of its range. And then there's the southern shield fern is in East Texas. They're virtually identical, or they're very difficult to tell the difference, but they're two different species. And then Mexican fern we are at the extreme northern edge of its range. The northernmost population I know of is in Emma Long Park. It's a very small population. It's actually fairly common though in Barton Creek, at least in the upper portion of the Barton Creek watershed. You can frequently come across Mexican fern at the base of limestone cliffs or growing on limestone boulders. It's a very distinctive fern. Yeah, you're looking right there at the sterile fronds. The fertile fronds are actually kind of have like little bead-like structures on them that are very different from the sterile fronds here. But we are at the extreme edge of its range in this area. So these three species could potentially be found together. They are found together on the preserve and probably nowhere else in the world. Now, within that broader mesic forest, there are several different niches, and one of the most easy to recognize is the plants that are adapted to living on and around limestone boulders and walls. And I kind of like to look at that specialized niche here a little closely. Of course, one of the plants, the most striking plant and definitely an indicator, it grows virtually nowhere else in our area, is wild columbine. The last indicator is actually a fairly wide range. It goes all the way up to Canada. But in our area, it's restricted to those moist canyons, and it grows almost exclusively on rock walls in those little solution pockets of limestone boulders. Mexican buckeye has a wider tolerance of habitats. It can grow in the open areas, it can grow on ridge tops, but it is almost always present also on these limestone and on boulders. So it's an indicator species for that kind of a niche. And then there's these two specialized ferns here. In our area, at least, they are found exclusively on limestone boulders. I have never seen either of them growing on the ground. They're always growing on limestone boulders. Black stem spleenwort actually ranges fairly widely through the southeastern United States, but it's not found in East Texas, surprisingly. There is a sister species called the ebony spleenwort that grows in East Texas, and is supplanted by black stem spleenwort here and farther west. It has that kind of ladder-like arrangement to the pinnae of the fronds, or leaflets, as we might call them, and it is epipetric, meaning growing on rocks, at least on the preserve. And then even more so is the other fern, the powdery cloak fern on the lower right. That's about a full-grown size plant there. They don't get much bigger than that. It's kind of a bluish green color tint to the leaves, and then the underside of the leaf has a white powdery farina that gives it its name. It's loose. I don't know what the purpose of that farina is, what it does for the plant. It may help absorb moisture that can be released to the plant in dry periods. It is not the spores. The spores are the in the dark structures that surround the edges of the fronds. But that white farina is kind of interesting because if you press it to your hand and your hand is a little moist and pull it away, you'll oftentimes see the imprint left of the leaf in your hand after you pull the frond away. Very distinctive for these rock walls. And in addition, we also do have some endemic species that are found here. One is two-flower anemone, and you may think, well, I have that one growing in my lawn. That is its close cousin, 10-petal anemone, also called windflower. That's one of my favorites. But the distinction is that windflower anemone has one flower per stalk. Two-flower anemone, and you can see there's an old flower here, if you can see my cursor, and that's one stalk. And then there's another flower that's now blooming on from that same plant, a second stalk arising from this whorl of leaves. And that's distinctive for two-flower anemone. They usually do tend to bloom asynchronously. You'll have one bloom and then the other one will start later. Here you can see one in full bloom here, and then there's a bud waiting to appear later on. These grow almost exclusively on limestone boulders. I almost never see them anywhere else in wooded areas. So they don't grow on your lawn, they don't grow in the park, they don't grow in a pasture. Those are windflower anemones. They are also usually white. Now I understand they can be purple or lavender, like windflower. Windflower, though, is much more variegated. You'll have a wide variety of colors in a patch of windflowers. These are almost always white, but they're exclusive to this environment, and they are limited to a grand total of 8 counties in the state of Texas. That's their entire world range. Of similar limited distribution is this strange little plant, Romer spurge. It usually grows only about 6 inches tall. This is highly zoomed in. That flower there that you see in the center here is about the size, the diameter of a pea. A very small flower. The overall color of the plant is that bright yellow-green, and you can have a patch of these that gives a yellow-green cast to the ground where they grow. It's an annual, growing in a grand total of 10 counties in Texas. And then, of course, we have one of the species of concern on our permit that is particularly found in this area, and that's Canyon mock orange. Now, until recently, Canyon mock orange was known from only 5 counties. And it hasn't been that there's been some new exploration and it's been found elsewhere. It's been a taxonomic change, apparently. And this species apparently has been merged with the Texas mock orange, found a little farther west on the plateau, which also ranges into Mexico. So it now has a much broader range. It may still merit species of concern status. Depending on how the taxonomy goes, it may be segregated out as a distinctive variety. I don't know how the taxonomy is going to go. This is a very recent change, but it is a really remarkable plant at any rate. You can see on the rock wall here where they're growing. They'll grow out of the tiniest little solution pit, and you can have a shrub that's 4 feet tall and 4 feet across that are growing out of a little pocket that's only 3 inches deep. I don't know how they do that, but they exclusively on rock walls. In nature, I've seen, we've had some that we've planted around the preserve office that are not on limestone boulders, and they seem to be doing okay. But this may be an adaptation to avoid browsing deer, perhaps, but that is primarily where they're found. It's a really, really pretty plant, particularly when it's in full bloom. Then other species you can often find in these limestone niches here, but they're much more widespread. Shrubby boneset, if you don't know that one, you should get to know it about now, because this is where the butterflies are going now. If they're still blooming, this is one of the latest blooming plants now in the fall, and the butterflies will zoom to it and be drawn to it like magnets. It's very common. It can be found in a wide variety of habitats, but particularly in limestone niches. Heartleaf nettle there is one of the few stinging plants in our area. It's fairly rare. I don't encounter it very often, but where I do find it is on these limestone boulders. It's not very big. It's only maybe about a foot tall is the tallest I see them. But you need to be careful of it if you're scrambling around on the rock boulders, because it will give you a sting. The other nettle here on this page is rock pellitory. It does not have stinging hairs. It's much more common. You can find it growing not only on limestone boulders, but in dry forest, in wet forest. It's particularly common in spring. You may also know it by another name. It is a very edible plant. And if you'd like to try it, it has a taste that should be instantly recognizable. At least it was. I tried it, giving it the name cucumber plant. And it has rather fuzzy leaves. So if you've ever wondered what a fuzzy cucumber would taste like, pick off a couple of these leaves and give them a try when they come up this spring. It's an interesting experience. It would be good in a salad. And then, of course, the cedar sage, those stunning red flowers that hummingbirds and butterflies love. over in the lower left corner there is usually common. It can grow quite readily out of those little pits in the limestone boulder, though it's not by any means restricted to that environment. As we move on to the next type of major forest, and that's the plants of xeric slopes and red tops. This is the dry forest. And you can see right here two of the plants that we just talked about. Cedar sage is red flowers, like candles that are popped up all along this dry ridgetop under the junipers. And then the yellow-green plant here next to the juniper in the left foreground, that is rock pellitory, cucumber plant. And this is really common for it to have a fairly extensive colonies scattered around on those dry forests in the spring. Now, dry forests have a tendency to get kind of ignored. It's an underappreciated community. And you've probably heard the expression, if you've been around very long, that nothing grows under cedars. Now, I kind of question that. And one of the big reasons for questioning that is there is one real big exception for things that love to grow under cedars, and that's the Texas madrone. We're at the extreme eastern edge of its range here, but it grows very well under junipers. As a matter of fact, it's one of the better places to find it. The junipers will probably provide some protection from desiccation, the summer droughts. And when the tree is a seedling, they also may protect it from deer browse. So I frequently, where I find Texas madrone, and it's not frequent, I usually find it growing under or around junipers. But that's a fairly scarce plant. It's still not very common. But still, in times and in places, it can actually be pretty lush under the junipers in these dry forests. This is taken in spring here. A lot of the plants here are rock pellitory, but there's a wide variety of other things. I think there may be some false dayflower over here. But there can be other plants that grow in this sort of environment. And at times it can be fairly lush, but this is maybe more typical. But even in this scene, the ground cover you see here, though it's sparse and it's not really showy, really striking plants in there, many of the species there are endemic, or else they're most abundant in this kind of a habitat. I wanted to look at some of those a little more closely. But that kind of indicates that, I think there's the misperception there that the only time this kind of habitat occurs is when juniper invades a prairie, or when juniper crowds out other trees. But the presence of species that are particularly adapted to juniper woods, I think, is a good indication that this is a legitimate forest community. It's not just something that happened as a result of human interference, but it is actually a legitimate community. And here is an interesting little set of plants. Now, it's not something that's going to really catch your eye generally. If your eye is caught, it's probably by that little golden mushroom down there, not by any of the plants in this picture. But what's interesting about this picture is that this sample group here is interesting because the plants tend to be endemic or specific to this, or most common in this environment. And we'll look more closely at these plants, but I just wanted to show you this grouping here, because these are plants that, you don't have oftentimes a lot of plants in the understory of these junipers, but the ones that are there are specialized for growing there. Now, taking a closer look at these, particularly that one on the left there, devil's shoestring, you probably know this already. It is they used to have close cousins of the yuccas. They may still be close cousins, but they've segregated them out into their own family, the Nolinaceae. I think that's true. But the Nolinas are yucca-like. They're grassy, but they have more like yucca leaves. They're thicker and very fibrous. can be used for basket making. This particular species, there are actually two species in our area. You may be familiar with both of them, or may think not distinguish between them. Sacahuista has smooth-edged leaves that are thickened. They're kind of crescent-shaped in cross-section. And the flower stalk rarely rises above the leaves. They're usually down in among the leaves or just on top of the leaves. Compared to devil's shoestring, which you can see on the left there, the flower stalk is oftentimes 4 or 5 feet tall. The leaves are also flat. They're not thickened, and they have finely saw-toothed edges, so you don't want to run your finger very quickly along the edge or you'll tear your skin. That may be how I got the name devil's shoestring. But devil's shoestring is found in only, I'm losing my notes here. There it is. Known from only 13 counties in Texas. The Illustrated Flora of East Texas, there's a note in there saying it's quite infrequent and becoming more so as its habitat is destroyed through development or overgrazing. It can grow in open areas, but it also is quite well adapted to growing under juniper shade. You can see the flowers there, kind of a rangy panicle of flowers. Oops, doing strange things here with my, there we go. Tiny little flowers, and then they produce these samaras. They're dry seeds that have papery wings surrounding them that help them help the wind to carry them, to disperse them. So that's one of the species you can find in this area, very distinctive, finding under the juniper. More showy plant is Lindheimer crownbeard. It looks a lot like a sunflower. It's in the sunflower family. And sunflower is a good comparison. The flowers are often 2 inches across. It's very showy when it blooms. It can go 4 to 5 feet tall, but it's more commonly about 2 or 3 feet tall. It's particularly notable. It's not actually closely related to the sunflower, so it's in their family. It's more closely related to frostweed, if you know frostweed, or cowpen daisy. Cowpen daisy is a very close cousin. They're in the same genus. And the flowers are very similar to cowpen daisy, but you can distinguish it partly because this grows in undisturbed habitat in wooded areas, in shade generally, whereas cowpen daisy is an annual that grows in disturbed areas such as, wait for it, cowpen. But frostweed will grow in similar circumstances here. You can also tell it from cowpen daisy because the leaves are like sandpaper. They're extremely rough, which may be the reason that deer don't like to eat it, which would make it a really good ornamental in a yard that has a lot of deer coming through it. But to my understanding, they are not frequently, or maybe not at all, cultivated in native nurseries, possibly because they are difficult to grow. Some of our staff have tried to had very little or no success. So if somebody comes through with an idea to grow Lindheimer crownbeard, they could be very popular in the native plant crowd. Some other species that are common under juniper canopy, juniper and live oak, the drier slopes and ridgetops, are twistleaf yucca. Of course, it can be found in more prairie areas and open rocky slopes, but it can grow quite well also under junipers. I've also seen in my own yard that when you have a yucca that is available for the deer to get it, they will eat those flowers off before they have a chance to go to seed. So it may well be that yuccas that bloom in the open may not produce as much seed as the ones that grow under trees, might be more protected. Twistleaf yucca is found only in 18 to 20 counties in Texas. The plateau milkvine here on the right is only found in 12 counties. It looks a lot like the pearl milkvine, except it doesn't have the little white pearl center in the flower, in the center of the flower, and the flower is more cup-shaped. But it does have, or saucer-shaped, but it does have the same very intricately green petals to the flower that are similar to the pearl milkvine. And this one is an endemic. It's found in only 12 counties. And then, of course, seven-leaf creeper, which can easily be mistaken for Virginia creeper, which has 5 leaves, 5 leaflets. Seven-leaf creeper has 7 time. It can have only 6 or 5, so it can be confusing at times. But this is a plant that is also primarily found in the dry forest of juniper, dominated by junipers, found in only 23 counties in Texas. And then the most limited of all of them is a little annual, actually not so little, it can look more like a shrub. It can grow 1 to 2 feet tall. Texas Samaria grows only in about 10 counties. It's in the snapdragon family. It has a bilaterally symmetrical flower, and it tends to grow in little sunny patches among the juniper trees, blooming in late summer, possibly taking advantage of tropical storms that come through in the summer, the moisture that comes from them. And then if you're really into botany, you get these plants here that are not particularly showy. You're not going to have people probably flocking to put them in their garden, their native plant nursery. But plateau silverbush, I don't know why it's called silverbush. It's not silvery. Another name is tall wild mercury. I think I have a name for it. They keep switching the genus name from Argothamnia to Ditaxis and back. So, you know, I put them both in here so you can recognize it. It grows about 2 feet tall. It's in the spurge family. Those staminate flowers there. Flowers are actually a bit more interesting. They have I don't know what that's called, a gynecium or something that is common to pistillate flowers in the spurge family. That's a little bit more interesting. It's known from only 16 counties on the Edwards Plateau and the adjacent north central Texas. And then the other one there is a grass, and yeah, I know, a grass, really? But this is really pretty interesting. In a lot of places, I'll find this grass growing under juniper in areas that they're really pretty dry, and this particular grass, which is known from only, what have I got here? 12 counties on the Edwards Plateau and the adjacent to north central Texas. Does not grow in mesic forest because probably it's too shady. It doesn't grow in prairies, probably because it's outcompeted by sun-loving grasses like little bluestem. But it does really quite well in juniper areas. And since I've gotten to know it, I found that it's pretty widespread. It's a little difficult to recognize, but eventually you can get, it has that really spare-looking panicle where the spikelets tend to hug the branches. And what's interesting is, you can see it a little bit here, right at the base of the larger branches is a short spur branch that often comes out at a right angle. And that's a distinctive feature. You can see it here. It's been twisted since this has been flattened for a botanical collection. You can't see that it's at a right angle, but this is a branch that comes off of a small branchlet that comes off the main branch. That's one way you can recognize Buckley tridens. In addition to these, there are also several near-endemic species, including a very showy Colorado Venus looking glass, and it's named not for the state of Colorado, not for the Colorado River that goes through the Grand Canyon, but from our very own Texas Colorado River. It's also sometimes called Western Venus looking glass, but I don't like that name because it's not that widespread, Western. It does range into Mexico, but it's primarily a plant of the Edwards Plateau. In addition to that, and it's an annual that blooms in the spring. It's very striking when it blooms. And then Blackfoot spurge, which again, you have to be kind of a botanical nerd to get excited about this one. It grows about 1 foot tall. It has this kind of interesting little flower, but you can see by the size of my fingers there, it's a tiny little plant, kind of wispy, not really very showy, but it particularly grows in this environment. And then you have cedar sedge and cedar rosette grass. I don't have pictures of them here. They can often be the dominant vegetation on the ground under junipers. But along with them, you can also find silver puff, which has the leaves there. It can sometimes look like a dandelion, particularly when it goes to seed, because the seed head is very much like a dandelion seed head. but you look at the leaves, they aren't as deeply lobed as the dandelion. And if you turn them over, they're a glossy silvery color, with silver scales on the underside of the leaf. So it's very easy to distinguish. It's very common in the juniper woodlands. Right about now, the bricklebush is blooming. I think slope bricklebush would be a better name for this plant. There are a couple of other bricklebush species. This one grows quite commonly on the preserve in juniper woods. That's it in its glory. It has these little yellow flowers that don't quite open all the way, and the reddish filaries on the compound flowers. This is in the Asteraceae, the sunflower aster family. And it's kind of a sub-shrub perennial. It dies back to a woody base every winter, and then comes back. And then prairie pinkroot, a plant that I get a lot of questions on because nobody seems to recognize it when it comes up. It blooms usually May, June. Little four-petaled flower. It's in the Logania family, and I don't know if representatives of that family, but it's one that's commonly found in the juniper woods. And then we have some that are possibly indicators. The Texas bush clover is also blooming now. It blooms in the fall. It's a sprawling vine with pink pea flowers and trifoliate leaves. White rock lettuce blooms in the spring. It looks like a dandelion, except it's white and it's a perennial, oftentimes in groups. And then there's the red asparagus, as it's sometimes called, the crested coral roots. We have actually found at least 4 species on the preserve. This one here pictured is Arizona crested coral root. It has recently been split off. It's distinctive in that usually the flowers do not open, so they are actually cleistogamous, are self-pollinating, but occasionally you'll have one to bloom. But you'll have that reddish stalk that rises up. It can actually be really difficult to spot on the brown forest floor unless you have a group of them. And sometimes you do have a group of them. This is one of the most spectacular groups I've ever seen. These plants are about 2 feet tall. This is the most common of the crested coral roots, spiked, spicata. It tends to have more of a golden color, golden brown color. But if you take a close look at the flowers, there's a closer look at the flowers there. The flowers the petals are a golden color with brown or purple brown streaks, and then the lower lip is white with those magenta streaks. This is the more common one. It can be in somewhat more open environments. Then you also have the Glass Mountains crested coral root, which tends to bloom a little later in midsummer. It has a more purplish pink stalk. The flowers often don't open on this species either, but when they do, they're a little bit not as golden colored as spiked crested coral root, a little bit more delicate. And then we got lucky and found these stunning little plants. One of our staff members found it on the BCP. We're keeping the location secret, but this was well known from the Chizos Mountains. And about 10 years ago, there was a colony found in Dallas County. But until one of our staff members found this one on the preserve, it was unknown in Travis County. These are an interesting group of plants because they are saprophytic microtrophic. They have a symbiotic relationship with the roots of trees and the mycorrhizal fungi that grow on the roots of trees. And they apparently since they have no green color, they do not synthesize their own. They do not photosynthesize. So they have to get nutrients from other sources, and they'll tap into fungal networks in order to get them. And as such, they are pretty well tied to the trees that host the mycorrhizal fungi, usually either junipers or oaks. I think the Glass Mountains coral root is primarily juniper. The spicata might be more oaks. So, Audrey, let me ask you, how much time do I have?
I'm glad you asked.
Yeah, it's okay.
You've got 7 minutes left. So far we have a couple of questions. If folks want to add more questions, go ahead. But you want to wrap it up in like a minute? Would that work?
I'll try to do that. This
Okay.
last community is kind of a micro community that's represented by one of our rare species that we're trying to protect. It's a candidate for listing called the bracted twistflower. That's it on the left there. And with Mark Sanders, one of my colleagues, that's a typical growth size. It can bloom from anything from 2 inches tall to 5 feet tall. It blooms in April and May, mid-April to late May. And we don't quite know how to predict why it is where it is. It's a forest species on the preserve, but elsewhere it grows in full sun. There are, however, a few species that frequently grow with it. Nothing range-wide, but on the preserve, we frequently find it with these species that are otherwise rather hard to find on the preserve. They're only common in association with bracted twistflower. Such as Paeonia, which looks like a tiny little pink carnation growing on the ground. A very pretty flower. It is in the sunflower family, but it has an unusual double. The flowers in the flower head are kind of double. They're unusual shape. I'm trying to rush through this here. There's the carnation flower. Also, you'll see sometimes thicket thread vine, more commonly in this area. This is a milkweed, though it doesn't look anything like it. It also is sometimes called bearded swallowwort because of the bearded petals of the flowers. They're tiny little flowers, very tiny little flowers. But if you get a close look, this is what they look like. And then there are a trio of other plants, this shrub called Oreja de Raton, or mouse's ear, Bernardia. Southwestern Bernardia is another name for it. It has those kind of scalloped, fuzzy leaves. That's the flowers. They're not really distinct. It's in the spurge family. This plant here with a tiny propeller-shaped flower, giving it sometimes the name Texas fan. The leaves look strikingly similar to one of the nose burns, but this is a lanky shrub that can grow 3-4 feet tall. It's lanky, but it has this interesting little flower. And then one of our more interesting ferns, one of my favorite ferns, zigzag cliffbrake. That's my name for it. It's got other names for it that I think are more official, but the stem is always a zigzag through the middle of the frond, and the kind of a heart-shaped or ovate leaflets. And these are plants that are found with bracted twistflower. And that wraps it up. So I think I did it, Audrey. I don't know.
You did it.
Right.
I'm glad we got to that. A lot of hits on that last slide. I'm glad we got there. So we got a few questions for you from David. The question is, are the resurrection ferns introduced to the region by human activity, or do they just happen to be growing outside of their range?
I think they happen to be growing outside of their range. I could be wrong, but I'm not sure where they're growing. It's such a remote canyon. I just can't. The one I introduced intentionally, just because, I mean, it would be an interesting plant to introduce. I think it would be in a garden growing, but I doubt it was introduced.
Lynn said, in the mesic forest, isn't Texas mulberry, Morus microphylla, a more typical indicator plant than red mulberry, Morus rubra?
It could well be, and I'd love to talk with you all about that, Lynn. And if you want to talk about that, I don't actually know about Texas mulberry. I seem to find it in bizarre places. Red mulberry definitely needs those deeper, wetter soils, and you find it in riparian areas. But Texas mulberry I found in a fairly dry environment sometimes. So I don't know enough about that plant to categorize it.
And then we've got one more question, and just right at the end of this, so that's great. We've from Daryl, who asks, to what extent do you think deer browse determines our plant distribution?
Oh boy. Oh my. I think it depends I think it determines a lot of it. I think there are places where we have a lot of deer that they can really wipe out a lot of the native flora, particularly understory flora, particularly if they're very edible species. but I don't know how to categorize that. I haven't seen enough places where deer have been excluded to be able to compare the flora in those areas to areas where the deer have not been excluded. A good question. I don't know the answer to that. And I want to put up the references here too. These are some references that I've used for this presentation.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you so much. And thanks for sharing those references. We can share a recording of this with folks. I know there's a lot to learn there. And thank you so much for sharing that, Bill. That was really cool.
All right, great. Hey,
yeah.
Twist my arm, make me talk about this thing, this stuff I love to talk about.
Yeah.
Hope you all enjoyed it and you all weren't bored and you enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. I hope everybody's doing well. Take care.